water resource economists in Canada. So she is a professor of economics at Brock University. She has held a chancellor's chair there for research excellence and was awarded the Brock University Distinguished Research and Creative Activity Award. She's also a member of Brock's Environmental Sustainability Research Center, and she was the scientific director of the Water Economics Policy and Governance Network, which is a CERC partnership grant that ran from 2016 to 2020. Professor Dupont works in the fields of environmental and natural resource economics, but focuses specifically on water and non-market valuation. Her research program concentrates upon examining ways to encourage more efficient and sustainable use of water resources, both on the supply and the demand side. On the supply side, she looks at factors that help to identify which water utilities operate most efficiently and sustainably. And then on the demand side, she uses these non-market valuation studies to determine the value of good water quality, for example, and focuses on individual perceptions of health effects of tap water, their willingness to pay for recreational activities related to water. And today she's going to talk to us about the work that she's done in the area of flood risks. I also should mention that she has held various editorial positions. We're very happy to have her on board of the journal Water Resources and Economics since the start of the journal in 2013, but she's been also on the board of the Canadian Journal of Water Resources, Society of Natural Resources, and the Australian Journal of Agriculture and Resource Economics. So a very impressive track record. Diane, we're very happy to have you with us here, and I'm happy to hand over the floor to you.
Thanks very much, Roy. Thank you, everyone. Even though I can't see you and you can see me, I'm very happy to be here to speak about some work today. Before I start, I would like to just acknowledge that Brock University, and of course where I'm living in St. Catharines, is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. And the territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties, and is within the land that is protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. So thanks very much. What I'm going to be talking about today is some work that I've been doing with a number of colleagues. I see Pat Lloyd-Smith is on the call from U Saskatchewan, James Price from University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and Vic Adamovich from Alberta. And this work has been supported by SSHRC and through SSHRC, the Water Economics Policy and Governance Network. And I want to thank everyone. I will just say this, even though I have acknowledged my colleagues, I'm not implicating them by any means. Some of the things I say are, what do they say? All comments are my own. So let me just go ahead then. So flood risks and household responses. And this work is going to cover off a very broad view at data from a couple of different surveys that we've been doing on looking at flooding and people's responses over time. So of course I have to put up, if Roy or Julie, if you could just change to the next slide, please. So this is an image, of course, of the flood that happened in Calgary in 2013, where the Bow River kind of overwent its banks, and there was a lot of flooding in the downtown core. And as you can see from the title, it forced as many as 100,000 people from their homes for a couple of days. So these are the kind of events that I want to be talking about, urban floods. Julie, could you please move to the next slide? Thanks very much. So I'll give you a bit of a background then in terms of what I want to talk about. Even though floods have been happening in Canada for a number of different years, it was really the Calgary flood in 2013, and then in the same year, Toronto also had a serious flood that I think really raised the profile of urban flooding. And even though lots of other places in Canada, Quebec, Manitoba, New Brunswick have had floods, these big urban center floods really raised the profile of flooding. And so in this talk, I want to give you a bit of a background on flooding in Canada, kind of events, costs. I want to talk about our approach to trying to elicit people's perspectives views of their risks and kind of actions they might take. And then I'm going to be talking some numbers. So these are quantitative values that we have been collecting from people, and then look a little bit at kinds of behavioral responses people might make to their flood risks. And then I want to end it off kind of coming back full circle to the background, which is where are we right now in terms of policy. So let's, thank you, move to the next slide. So there is something called the Canadian Disaster Database, although it has not been updated for the last few years, but for a while, for almost a 50-year period, it was collecting information on different kinds of natural disaster events that happen in Canada, including flooding. And over that period, there were over 250 separate flooding events that were identified, all the way from things that were very small that did not impact many people or in a very large way, through to, of course, the events in Calgary. And you can see where some of the big areas where these events have been taking place. Now, of course, as I said, the database is no longer, at least I haven't been able to find an updated version of it, but in the last year and a half, well, basically a year, we've had two really major events. One was the atmospheric flooding in BC in 2021, literally just a bit more than a year ago. And then, of course, just recently, there was the hurricane-caused flooding in Halifax that led to a lot of disruption. So I would argue that flooding is suddenly on people's radar in a way that previously has not been the case. And in some weird kind of way, we think about Canada as being a bunch of solitudes. Well, this is one area in which we can kind of come together. There have been floods all across Canada. All Canadians have been impacted by floods. Could you move to the next slide, please? Thank you. And so the natural thing to ask is, okay, we've talked about extent of floods or volume of number of floods, if you will. What kind of costs are we talking? And this is why it's important. Floods are costly events. And the most recent estimates for the BC flood event that took place a year ago is about $9 billion in damage repair costs. And that's both residential and also infrastructure. Now, that number has basically doubled. About a year ago, they thought it was going to be about 5 billion. Now they're thinking at the end of the day, it will be close to double that value. Try to put this into perspective. Reported expenses for all natural disasters. Now, this is not just floods, but all natural disasters in Canada. And this over this period, the last, 6 years, basically, were about 15% of GDP. And interestingly, floods, in spite of all of the wildfires that have been happening as a natural disaster, the share of flooding as a natural disaster in terms of the costs has grown to, it's basically a third, and it's been growing very quickly over the last few years. All of which is to say, this is a big issue, it's a big problem. And so now we want to start looking at who's involved. So if you could move to the next one. Thanks, Julie. So there are three kind of economic actors that we can think about that would be involved. One is government. One is private companies. I'm thinking explicitly insurance companies. And the third, of course, is the household, either a homeowner or a tenant, a renter. And I'll come back to those two in a moment. But let's talk about government role and the role of insurance companies, because this really sets the stage for the way in which our other economic actors, households or homeowners and renters, are going to be operating and making decisions. So in terms of responsibility, provinces and territories have authority over water management within their borders. Now, strictly speaking, that means provinces and territories are ultimately responsible for flood issues. However, they have largely ceded authority and responsibility for this to municipal governments or regional governments. And these lower level regional governments have been the ones who've been charged with looking into flood prevention, flood control, and by and large, control has happened through land use regulations, or I would say the absence of land use regulations. And interestingly enough, of course, municipal authorities, while they have in some senses a big responsibility, also have the least amount of funding available to pay for flood damages. Now, on the other hand, the federal government plays a really interesting role here. Strictly speaking, it doesn't have authority to manage water within provinces or territories' borders, but it does have authority for water through its role in terms of national fisheries, in terms of First Nations lands, in terms of navigation. So there are areas in which the federal government can get involved with water. However, when we come to floods, the biggest way that the federal government has been involved is essentially as a lender of last resort. And what do I mean by that? Back in 1970, the federal government agreed, as a result of actually some pretty big flooding that had taken place in the 1960s, agreed that it would start essentially assisting provincial governments and therefore municipal governments with disaster funding relief. And they created the disaster financial assistance arrangements. Over the last 50 years, 1970 and 2021, more than $6 billion has been transferred from the federal government through the provinces, ultimately to municipalities, and then to homeowners to deal with damage costs relating to flooding. And it's been really interesting because the problem with the federal government being a lender of last resort is it's created a moral hazard problem for both the provinces and the municipalities, in the sense that these agencies that are supposedly charged with looking after flood control have not borne the full cost of their decisions. They have been able to obtain money from the federal government to pay for a lot of the damages that have happened. And so there's and this is an issue going forward, I think, for whichever level of government is involved with flooding, in terms of making sure that the incentives align with the actions. And I think that's a challenge that we're going to face. Provinces, municipalities have not faced full costs, and that have led them to make certain kinds of decisions, particularly over land zoning, that in retrospect would not have been done if they had not been able to call on the federal government for financial support. Could you please move to the next slide? Thank you. So what about the role of private insurance? So clearly, private insurance companies have a motivation to maximize profits. You're aware of homeowner insurance to insure your house against fire and other kinds of damage, and typically certain kinds of water damage may or may not have been covered in the past. But typically water damage has been aside from typical homeowner packages or tenant packages. And for a number of years, there's always been optional property insurance for sewer backup. But it was only in 2015 that Canada actually had optional overland flood insurance. Prior to that time, you could not obtain overland flood insurance for your property. And so just so everyone's clear, sewer backup is when there's intense rainfall, the sewers back up, typically if you've got combined sewer overflow issues, and sewer water can come into your basement. You could buy, prior to 2015, insurance to deal with that. However, if water overflowed its banks and came in through the cracks in your basement, say or if your property wasn't graded particularly well, you were living close to a river that overflowed its banks, that would be an example of overland flood, and that would not have been covered by your insurance policy. So as of 2015, private insurers in Canada have offered overland flood insurance. And at the beginning, the uptake was pretty slow, but it's grown. Actually, it's now about 50%. It's gone from about 20 to 50% over about a 5 or 6 year period. And I will say this, Canada is basically the last developed country to have brought in overland flood insurance. It's been in many other countries for a number of years. Part of the reason maybe why we've been so late to the game is it's typically the premiums are quite expensive because the insurance company needs to assess the risks and then decide on what the premium might be. And since it's optional, people may choose not to purchase it. There is another issue with overland flooding, which is that about 10% of homes in Canada, it's about 1 million residences, have been designated as being in high flood risk areas, and private insurers will not insure them. So about 10% of these homes just cannot purchase private insurance to deal with it. Okay, so let me move on to the next thing, and that's kind of the background. Okay, so you've seen a bit of the landscape of who's involved, the considerations that homeowners face when they're trying to decide how to personally deal with floods. So let me turn to what we've done then. So we did some surveys. We did 2 surveys that I'm going to speak about. And I'll give you a moment to take a look at this very old cartoon. I think this is at least about 10 years old. So it shows you flooding concerns have been around for a while. We, of course, are not God, and we are not going to improve future floods, but we're hoping that with some of the data we collect, we'll be able to help add information to the policy landscape because we'll learn more about what do people think about floods? Do they think they're risky? And what do they do as a consequence of these natural hazard risks that they might face? Okay, so if you could move to the next one. So as I mentioned, I'm going to be speaking about results from 2 different surveys. They were both cross-Canada surveys that were largely representative of the Canadian population. One we did in 2016, and we collected about 1,600 household responses. And in that survey, one of the key things we did is we elicited what I call here personal views of basement flood risks, literally asking people to quantify the personal risk that they see to their basement flooding over a future time horizon. And I'll show you the question in a minute. We also asked if they had either sewer or overland flood insurance. And then we asked finally about the types of private measures they might take within their residence to mitigate their flood risks. So if you could move to the next slide, please. So this is the actual question. This is an internet-based survey that we used. And the question said, looking forward 10 years, based on your experience and understanding of water management in your community, what would be your best guess of the annual % chance that your household will experience the following flooding events? And then we asked people to give us a percentage. And prior to this page, we had explained to people what 1 in 10 meant in terms of what 10 in 10 meant in order to try to translate things into probabilities. And you can see here, we also tried to put the basement flooding into perspective. So we asked about street flooding, boil water advisories, basement flooding, and then we also asked about loss of power flooding, again, to kind of get people to put the basement flooding into a perspective. So if you could turn to the next page, please. So what did we find? So this is from the 2016 survey. These are stated basement flood risks on an annual annual basis. And for homeowners, the average was 14.2. Now, this includes people who said 0. And I'm going to talk a little bit about more that in just a moment. So included within this average, 14.2. So clearly this is it is an underestimate for people who don't believe or who do believe they do have risks. And then for renters, it was 15.3%. And interestingly enough, we did not focus on, or we did not think so much about the role of renters versus homeowners in this particular survey. And it just so happened that our population was about 1/3 renters, 2/3 homeowners, which is in fact the Canadian landscape in terms of ratio homeowners to renters. But it became quite important to think about renters in this particular context. And more importantly, you can see renters have a slightly higher stated belief in what their flood risk is, but it actually was statistically significant in terms of compared to the homeowners one. Could you move to the next slide, please? Okay, so let me leave that aside for a moment. And I want to talk just very briefly about the survey that we're actually doing right now. And I've got 22, 23 up there because the survey is going to go into 2023, I'm pretty sure. What have we got to date? Well, we've done a similar kind of survey, but we've used a lot of our results from the first survey to really refine this second survey. And so, for example, we've asked explicitly around not just basement flooding, but we've asked around basement flooding related to from sewer overload. And we've asked about basement flooding related to overland flooding. So to try to separate out those two things. So to date, we've got, I'm only going to be able to speak about the 200-person pilot that we've completed so far. We have a second 200-person pilot that has just been completed, and we're just waiting for data to come in. And ultimately, we're going to be adding another 2,500 respondents to this particular survey. So it's going to be a fairly large survey, again, representative of the population, but explicitly looking at that split between renters and homeowners. And we've refined our questionnaires, so we have separate questions for renters and homeowners around their actions and their beliefs. So could you please turn to the next one? So in this particular survey, so this is the 2022 survey now, we asked our question around people's belief in the risk of their basement flood happening to them in a slightly different way. And in particular, again, we wanted to give some more context to things. So thanks to James, we created this kind of temperature gauge, if you will, where we kind of put some landmarks about what we thought different chances were, different probabilities of them happening within a given time period. And so on this, people would see this screen, they could read through and understand what high risk versus low risk was, or high chance versus low chance. And then there were 4 separate screens that came afterwards, and people were asked to use a slider, so a very interactive type of thing, where they would locate their risk on this temperature gauge. And we asked them explicitly around the basement flooding due to overland flooding and basement flooding due to sewer backup. So 2 separate questions there. And then again, because we wanted to put things into context, we asked around internet going out, happens to everybody. And we asked also around power shortage, just again, to put these certain kinds of risks into context. So could you please move to the next slide? Thank you. So again, this is very preliminary. This is our 2022 survey. It's only based on 200 observations. We were able to separate out stated flood risks between those caused by sewer backup and those caused by overland basement flooding. And over the whole sample, it was 27% sewer backup chance and 29% overland basement. When we separated out between homeowner and renter, the numbers are very similar, with renters, of course, being a little bit higher. And we would have expected that based on what we found in the first survey we did in 2016. What's really interesting here to me, though, is that even though both groups, the stated risks for both groups have gone up, the ones for homeowners have increased by almost double relative to what they were. So previously it was 14% for homeowners. Now, again, we didn't break it out between sewer backup or overland. Now it's, say, 20, 26, 27%, almost double what it was before. The previous one for renters was 15. It's actually pretty much double too. So people seem to be expressing more awareness of the risks, certainly believe that there's a potential high risk. Again, these include zeros. I haven't done the calculation. Again, it's about a third of the sample that believes there is no risk, that their risk is zero. Could you please turn to the next page? Thanks very much. Okay, so now I want to go back to the 2016 data because we've got a little more information there. And I want to start linking those stated risks with their experience in perhaps previous flooding events and with the types of actions they might take. So there's no degree of causality here. This is atemporal in the sense that we're simply looking at what was your stated flood risk. Did you have a previous experience with a flood? And so you see the columns are some people, the first column is flood experience. So they've had a previous experience. The second column is no experience. So no previous flood experience. And then the four categories that I've identified here are 2 for homeowners and 2 for renters. And I've decided to take kind of 2 extremes. Basically, the first row there is a homeowner who has both insurance and has taken some in-home protection. So they've done some or protective action. So they've done something to their residence to make it safer. And I'm going to come back to what those actions might be, but they've taken some form of self-protection, if you will, versus a homeowner who's done neither, has no insurance, has not undertaken any kind of protective action. And then we have the same 2 categories for renters, those who have both insurance and have taken some protective action, and renters who've done nothing. And by the way, tenants can purchase not only optional sewer backup insurance, but optional overland flood insurance. You can add that to your tenant policy. Okay, so let's have a look at the numbers here. So first column, the flood experience, unequivocally, if people have had experience with a flood, they believe their future flood risks are higher going forward relative to people who've not experienced a flood. And the literature is replete with these examples. And so that's no surprise. What I think is very interesting, though, is that homeowners who've done nothing, obviously, even if they've had flood experience, their belief in what their flood risks going forward are still much lower. And that may be correlated with that maybe they're more risk averse. We don't know the answer to that. And so one of the components of the survey that we're working on right now, the 2022, is we've developed a series of questions to get at not only people's constant risk aversion, but also their degree of kind of rate of time preference. You know, how much do they discount the future? Because clearly in these risk beliefs, there's some belief about what's going to be happening in the future and the way people trade off current and future kinds of events. So what does this table tell me? Well, renters appear to have higher beliefs in their likelihood of facing a flood. And that may be because they feel more vulnerable. They have less agency in some senses. They can't control what their landlord does. On the other hand, if they haven't had any flood experience, people tend to have much lower values. So and in some cases, those differences are actually statistical. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. And in this one, I want to focus only on homeowners. So James and I did some work with the 2016 data in which we said, okay, well, let's just take a look at homeowners. And that's what this work is. We wrote a chapter recently for a book on financial vulnerability because we were interested in over the last few years in Canada, housing prices have gone up so much. People are in very high mortgage debt to kind of income situations. There's a lot of financial vulnerability associated with having a home. And now we add on flood or potential flood issues. And so we wanted to start looking at that and how that might play through. So looking only at the homeowners, and in the sample that was about 900 people ultimately in our sample who had a data set that had complete information that we wanted to look at. 2/3 of those people said they believed their flood risk, their basement flood risk, was something greater than 0. So it means 1/3 of people believe their risk is 0. And so what we ended up doing then is looking at those two groups and saying, okay, let's look and see how different the positive risk folks are from the 0 risk folks. And just as a side note, earlier I showed you that over the entire sample, the homeowners felt their risk was about 14%. For those people who have a positive belief in their risk, they believe their annual basement flood risk is 22%. That's just the homeowners. Can you move to the next slide, please? Thanks. Okay, so remember I said we kind of broke people up into two groups, those with a 0 risk, those with a non-zero risk. And then we ran a bunch of probates to look and see, well, what factors might help explain that non-zero, the presence of a non-zero stated flood risk. And positively, in all of these cases, someone who's retired tends to believe that their risks are non-zero. If they've got university degrees, they tend to believe they've got non-zero risks. If they've lived in their community more than 10 years, they believe they've got non-zero risks, because that may be just familiarity, seeing what's happened in the community, seeing other people being flooded, kind of knowing something about their community. And I want to come back to that point about being familiar with your community when we talk a little bit about policy. Being in Ontario and a prairie province relative to BC. Now, mind you, this is a 2016 data. It'll be interesting to see what happens with 2022 data in BC. And of course, prior flood experience, the things we might expect to see. Can you please move to the next slide? Okay, so we've identified kind of the socio-demographic characteristics that would be more likely to lead people to have positive flood risks. Let's look a little bit about how people might be responding to these positive flood risks. So what can you do if you've got this positive flood risk? Well, obviously, I've spoken earlier, you can buy insurance. If you're not living in a high risk area, you can buy insurance. You can also undertake in-home protective actions. You can do both. And we have a number of people in our sample who do both. Or you can do nothing. So you don't buy insurance, you don't do any self-protection. Now, of course, there's a third option, which is our fourth option, I guess, which is you could move yourself away to another location. And interestingly enough, in our focus groups for the 2022 survey, some people did actually mention having moved away as a result of a bad experience. And so we actually have a question in our survey to ask whether people moved away and if that was a major kind of reason for leaving a previous residence, a previous flood experience. So I'll be interested to look at that data. Can you move to the next slide, please? Okay, so let's have a look at the extent of what I call in-home protective actions, and then I'm going to come back to the insurance reaction, I guess. So what can somebody do? So there are non-structural protective actions. So in our survey, we asked people if they had done things like, did they have a safety plan? Had they moved things around in their house, out of the basement, for example? So non-structural, generally non-costly types of activities. And about half the sample said, yes, they've done that. Now, remember, these are just homeowners. About almost 1/5 of the sample said they'd done minor structural protective actions. And so minor would be things like moving your electrical plugs up above what you thought my water line might be, maybe moving appliances or important documents. Important documents was a non-structural protective, but moving an appliance out of a basement would be an example of a minor structural. Sandbags in Quebec, if you live along a river, you buy sandbags. That was a minor structural protective action. Purchase of a sump pump. About 10% had done major structural. And so by major structural, that could be all the way from you grade your property away, you put in weeping tiles, to you change the architecture of your home to make it flood prone. And 3% of the sample did all three. So those are the folks who are really self-protecting. Can you move to the next slide, please? Okay, so what kinds of factors affected or would kind of contribute to these in-home protective actions, doing these actions? Prior flood experience was associated, but only with major structural actions. Perceived flood risk seemed to be really important at explaining whether they undertook minor structural or non-structural actions. But interestingly enough, there is no discernible sociodemographic pattern. In other words, age, education, gender, those things just didn't seem to matter for whether or not they undertook these different types of action. Can you move to the next slide, please? Now, what about insurance purchase? So again, in our 2016 survey, about a third of the sample bought both, about a third of the sample bought neither, and that left about a third of the sample by their having either one or the other, with the majority having kind of sewer insurance. You can move to the next slide, please. What were the factors that would explain whether or not people purchase these different types of insurance? Now, this is where it gets interesting. It was all the sociodemographics that didn't matter for the in-home kind of protection action. It was, and positively, age, older people, income, very, very positively related to insurance purchase, and interestingly enough, presence of children. But perceived flood risk and experience did not impact the insurance decision. Okay, so can you move to the next slide, please? I've just got about 2 or 3 slides left, and then I'm happy to answer any questions. So what are the implications? So interestingly enough, the Bank of Canada, of course, has been very worried over the last few years about kind of financial vulnerability. And with our looking at flood risks and people's responses to them, or their behavioral responses to them, it's kind of interesting to put the Bank of Canada's work in the context of what we're doing. So they did this study in 2021, and they basically looked at the overlap between where natural disasters had happened in Canada and financial vulnerability. So, you know, people had high loan to kind of mortgage ratios. And now it's all natural disasters. They didn't have it broken out by floods, but just all natural disasters. And they found that households in areas with the combination of high disaster exposure, and a lot of it was flood, and high indebtedness held 40%, 39% of total household debt. So these are households that are very financially strapped. So they have financial vulnerability just from their mortgage, but they've got another type of vulnerability or potential vulnerability related to potential floods and the additional costs that come with flooding events. So what does our work suggest? Well, it suggests that low-income households are less likely to purchase insurance and be more vulnerable. I will just say this now. You don't have to have any kind of flood insurance to get a mortgage. In other countries, you have to have flood insurance to get a mortgage. That might be a policy suggestion going forward, because floods are potentially very expensive things to happen to households, particularly if their mortgages, if their loan rate is very high. Secondly, new homeowners tend to be younger, lower income. They tend to be more cash strapped. They've also got, you know, high mortgages. They're less likely to be undertaking in-home protection, partly because they may not know the neighborhood. They may not have lived in their community for a while. They've just bought into it. So they've got a kind of triple whammy going after them. They're lower income, they've got high debt, and they don't have the kind of background experience that might suggest to them perhaps they need to either undertake some kind of self-protection or maybe purchase some insurance. Okay, so can we go to the second last slide? I think it's oh no, it's not quite. Well, I'll maybe end, and then I've got 1 or 2 more slides. So where's Canada going from here? So I want to come back to the policy realm again. Obviously, with all of the expensive floods that have been happening and the federal government lending a lot of money, it's already committed something like $5 billion to BC. And of course, it's committed funding to Halifax now already. A couple of years ago, the federal government convened a public-private task force. So they brought insurance companies in to look at flood insurance and relocation. And they were explicitly focused on, what do we do with people in high-risk properties, those potentially million or 10% of the properties that literally cannot purchase overland flood insurance. The task force finally reported just a couple of months ago, and in their findings, they noted that more than 50% of flood losses are uninsured, which suggests a lot of people are not purchasing insurance for a variety of different reasons. And this is a big potential liability going forward for the federal government. And of course, it does not want to necessarily have that liability. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So where's Canada going to go from here? Well, interestingly enough, this report said, and I'm sure the federal government was happy about that, it was unsustainable for government to continuously fund major recovery costs. And so the report then went on to say, okay, well, in effect, how could we expand insurance coverage, particularly to high-risk properties? And one of the ideas floated was to have a mandatory national residential flood insurance program for high-risk homes that potentially, potentially could be managed by private insurers, but with government is kind of an insurer of last resort, a kind of bolster, if you will, to it. And there are a couple of other suggestions for how this might play out. This is clearly an ongoing conversation. This may be happening. But it's really interesting because it kind of gets at the heart of who is responsible for dealing with flooding, with paying the costs of flooding damages. And I'm going to leave you with two last slides because I think this is kind of interesting. So in the most recent survey that we've done, we're actually doing some work where we actually have a contingent valuation question in which we ask people about their willingness to pay for a mandatory overland flood insurance scheme. We don't have enough data yet to kind of say anything, but one of the questions we did ask people is to rank which of the economic entities, if you will, should be most responsible to pay for water damages associated with essentially overland flooding, severe rain events. And they were asked to rank these 5 entities: provincial, federal, municipal governments, insurance companies, and then home or property owners or landlords in the case of tenants, from most responsible to least responsible. So who should be paying? And so far, if you can turn to the last slide, here's where we're at. So there's one, thanks very much. Most to least responsible. By and far, people believe insurance companies should be most responsible for paying for the damages, then homeowners or landlords, then municipal government, provincial government, and federal government. And I find it really interesting because right now it's probably reversed. The federal government is paying the most. Insurance companies are paying a good share, but then of course, we got 50% uninsured losses, then we've got homeowners doing it. And ironically, the provincial government, which is ultimately responsible for water management within the province, is at the moment kind of doing the least in some senses, and people don't believe it should be doing a lot either. But I think that's a whole interesting policy question. So at any rate, this is all I've got to mention for now. Stay tuned for future results, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Diane. That was great. So this is a Value of Water webinar series, and we value water, of course, a lot. But if we have too much of it, we have a dislike, and we face damages, and in many cases we would like to be compensated for the damages that we suffer. So what your story reminds me of a lot, and thank you once again, many thanks for giving this interesting presentation, is what happened where I originally come from, where people for centuries got compensated by the government if they faced floods, because water management was a government responsibility, and also there it was untenable. The sea level rise, climate change increasing and more frequent and more intense rainfall, it was just impossible for the government to keep up paying people, and in some cases, people also lived in places where they shouldn't be living, and so there is actually quite a bit of history already, I think, maybe also in some other countries where these situations occur. And actually, you're doing a special issue in water resource and economics with Wout Botsen, my former colleague in Amsterdam. He's done a lot of work on flood insurance and whether it should be mandatory or voluntary. And one of the reasons of making it mandatory is also to spread the costs, because there are different risks, and so people that do not run so much risk are maybe less inclined to pay for it. And the costs, the reinsurance of the insurance industry is a major issue for insurance companies also to be getting into this particular market. We have a number of questions, so those of you who participated online, please add your questions into the Q&A box. I'm just going to kick off, and it's related to the first question by John Livernois. I was wondering a little bit to what extent your perceived risks corresponded with the actual risks, and it relates to John's question because he asks the question, do you know the location of the respondents? And he imagined that the location, for example, if it would be in a floodplain, would be an important factor.
Yeah, that's a very good question. One thing I meant to mention is that floodplain mapping in Canada is in an abysmal state. The maps are quite old, they're very fragmented, and there's not a lot of good documentation. And in addition, the definition of a high risk is a moving target. So the engineers used to use this 1 in 100-year flood. They've realized that that's actually not they've already had several 1 in 100-year floods in Calgary within the last decade. So I think they've realized perhaps that's not the best definition. So that's all in progress. That's all kind of changing as we go. We did ask, and we do have information on people's postal codes. And so we did do some work with that. We were able to locate where they were. Now, Canada, a number of years ago, created kind of an area that identified over Canada kind of high risk and low high risk and not high risk areas. And we were able to get access to that data, and we did link it up to our subjective data sets. It's not perfect because, of course, a postal code is still a very large region. So you could be in the same postal code as where floods happen, but you're on a hill or, so we don't have a very good sense of what people's I guess the short answer is we don't have a good sense of where people's objective risks are. Now, we did actually do something with that where we kind of, in the engineering literature, they have this scale of what they call relative flood risk, and it's based on proximity to the water body and kind of vertical distance from the water body. And so we did some work with that where we kind of classified everybody according to whether they were within a very close proximity, so 100 meters kind of thing, to a kilometer away. We tended to find, and here's the thing, the highest risk beliefs were in the area that we called severe. So people, if they were living in a severely flood prone area, well, they weren't told it was that, but what we classified as severe, then they had the highest belief in risk. But then it was kind of a U-shaped curve. So for the next category down, it was a much lower risk. But then by the time you went to I'm living, a mile up and a mile away, they had the highest risk. So it could be that their risk is so high, so that's why they've moved away. So that shows the problem that these things need to be more temporal as well. We're trying to match up different time periods of things. But yeah, we tried to do some work with that. The other thing I will say is, I know some work that's been done by some folks at Waterloo, actually, in politics. They have kind of asked people if they live in high risk zones, and a lot of people don't seem to know. And in our current survey, we've asked that, and I haven't even looked at that data yet. But our whole definition of, what is a risky area, getting at subjective risk or objective risk is really hard. short of, do you live, have you seen the banks overflow outside your window kind of thing. In addition to, now in this latest survey, in addition to their asking people, what's your postal code, so we can kind of geolocate them, we've also asked how close do they live to a water body. So trying to get at that visual representation. But short answer is it's hard to do. I wish we had better geolocation data on the flood, on the actual flood event side of things.
Yeah, very good point. Yeah, it's Jason Thistlethwaite, I believe, isn't
Yes,
it?
that's
One
right.
of the people that
Jason
is looking
and
at this.
Daniel Henstra, I think his name is.
Yes, Dan Henstra, political science. Yes, yeah, they do a lot of work on flood risk mapping. Yeah, it's really there's a real need for that. Otherwise,
well,
it's going to be difficult also to insure.
Absolutely, absolutely. In the US, of course, they've got very good mapping on where risks are, particularly the southern US. And, you have to have insurance, and it's government. You have to buy it essentially through the government. So they've got very good sense of what's in and outside a high risk zone. We don't have that in Canada.
Yeah. So there is another question by Ali, and his question relates a little bit to what you just mentioned about measuring the distance to the river. He asks you the question whether you are able to distinguish between the risks of pluvial flooding and riverine flooding.
No, and no. Unfortunately, we're just assuming a flood happens for whatever purpose. That would be nice, but that would literally be, I guess we'd literally have to do like a time diary with people, like to do, measure the amount of rainfall that happened kind of right by your door. And that would be, other than trying to figure out from the geography, I guess, of the area, what the chances might be. Sadly,
yeah.
no.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Maybe another quick question from my side. What interested me was this distinction that you made between renters and homeowners. So you said that renters are also insured, but that must be home. Do you make a distinction between different types of insurance as well, like home content versus a building or structure?
So we asked, do you have optional overland flood insurance? Do you have optional sewer backup? Yeah, and you can buy a tenant policy that has optional overland flood insurance. So for example, like I own a condo in Toronto, for example. Any water coming in through the windows would be my responsibility, and that would be considered an overland flood.
That's interesting. So
yeah.
in Europe, in a lot of cases, homeowners have an insurance for structural home damage, and that could include like an overland flood. And at most, a renter would have a home content insurance. So right. The property
that's definitely the norm. But again, I think the insurance company, I will say this, the insurance companies have been very proactive at moving into this space. And by the way, to get back to Ali's question, the insurance companies have a very good sense of what the actual risks are. They've invested heavily in better mapping. So they've got it's their business. They know what these risks are. But they've understood as well that they can subdivide the market, that there are people who are willing to purchase these kind of add-ons. And so, to self-protect.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much, Diane. There are no more questions. We're almost at the hour. So thank you so much once again for being with us this morning, this afternoon, and sharing your experiences with us. It was really great. As I mentioned, this was the last webinar of the year. What I will put in the chat box is a link to the program for the first months of 2023. So we look forward to reconnect with you in the new year. On the 15th of February, we'll have the first webinar again by John Hartig. He's a visiting scholar at the University of Windsor's Great Lakes Institute for Environmental Research, and he's going to talk about an ecosystem approach to the value of water in the Great Lakes specifically. So I hope to see you all again in February in the new year. Happy holidays in the meantime, a happy new year already as well. And Diane, thank you so much once again for giving this presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much for inviting me, Roy.
You're very
And thanks
welcome.
to Julie for the great background support.
It worked out great. Thank you. And thank you all online for participating and asking your questions. Thank you all. Take care.
Bye, everybody.